business knowledge, artistry, compassion, and leadership. All of these things are necessary in the funeral industry. Every family is different, but in a time when they are at their weakest, they need a caring and understanding person to help them throughout the process. To start, it's important to know where this business comes from, so let's start from the beginning. As far back as researchers have found, burial grounds of Neanderthal man dating to 60,000 BC have had deceased with animal antlers on the body and flower fragments next to the corpse, indicating some type of ritual and gifts to the deceased. One of the first examples of this was unearthed in the Shanandar cave in Iraq. Neanderthal skeletons were discovered with a layer of pollen. With no great intellect or customs, the Neanderthal man instinctively buried their dead with ritual and ceremony. This may suggest that Neanderthals believed in an afterlife, but were at least capable of mourning and were likely aware of their own mortality. The most ancient and universal of funeral monuments were simple and natural, consisting of a mound of earth or a heap of stones raised over the ashes or body of the deceased. In 4000 BC, the idea of embalming was discovered by the Egyptians, and since 1000 BC, urn funerary or cinerary urns have been used as vessels to contain cremains. The idea of taking care of the dead is one that has been around for quite some time. They are known as funeral rites, and they are as old as the human race itself. Every culture and civilization has attended to the proper care of their dead. Every human culture ever studied has three common threads for death and the disposition of their dead: some type of ceremony, funeral rite, or ritual, a sacred place for the dead, and memorials for the dead. Fast forward to a more modern idea of the funeral director. In early America, home funerals were the practice everywhere, and each community had a group of women who came in to help with the laying out of the dead. Visitation was held in the front parlor, followed by a procession to the church and cemetery. Until the mid-1800s, most families cared for their own dead. They prepared, dressed, and displayed their loved ones within the confines of their own home. Early American houses often did not have parlors. However, as houses grew and national mannerisms became more set, proper families made sure that they had front rooms filled with their finest possessions: quality furniture, portraits, sterling silver, and often a piano. Because these rooms were usually clean, closed off, and quite formal, people often used them when someone died as a place to lay out the body and allow funeral visits. The body was usually displayed in a casket that was made or even purchased at the general store.
It was very common in the 1800s for people to buy their caskets from furniture stores, which many funeral homes began their life as, including the first funeral home in the United States.
Grander homes of the 19th century had a false or death door placed off of the formal room that led to the outside without steps to remove a deceased family member. It was considered improper to remove a body through the door the living crossed to enter. Also, it was considered bad form to carry them out feet first. Later, a grave was dug in the family cemetery. Since home parlors have been largely replaced by funeral homes, the formal front room or parlor has been turned into a modern family living room. Caring for your own dead began to change dramatically during the Civil War. Soldiers were dying on the battlefield, and their families would want them sent home for burial. This is when the practice of embalming, for shipping bodies over long distance, first began to take place regularly. Dr. Auguste Renoir, a U.S. physician, was one of the early leaders in the field, laying the groundwork for present-day embalming methods. During this time period, the family graveyard was moving towards the more park-like setting of the local cemetery. Also, the United States established a number of national military cemeteries where members of the armed forces were and continued to be buried. Soon after came the undertakers, who undertook this duty for the families at a time of need. It was not long before this became the normal way for families to take care of their dead. Over time, undertakers became known as morticians and funeral directors. In the beginning of the 1900s, the newly formed National Funeral Directors Association, or NFDA, was pressing its members to consider themselves professionals, not tradesmen as early coffin makers had been. Regular use of embalming was encouraged, and the new professionals used it to suggest they were keepers of the public health. Now, before I move on, you're probably wondering why I'm talking about funeral directing. Well, after I graduate, I plan on attending AAMI, or American Academy McAllister Institute for Funeral Service, in New York City. When I am licensed, I will be a fourth-generation funeral director in my family. Hancock Funeral Home Ltd., my family's funeral home, has had its doors open since 1917, when it was started by my great-grandfather in Philadelphia. It is still in Philadelphia today and is one of the most used funeral homes in the city. My schooling will include 1 full year of attending classes, followed by a 1-year apprenticeship. Then I will have to pass local and federal boards to attain my license.
McAllister was difficult because it was a lot of tests every week, a lot of memorization, things like that, and traveling to New York City. A lot of the classes that I took were anatomy, microbiology, chemistry, accounting, clinical embalming, just things like that, just a lot of hard science classes.
Now, let's see what the modern funeral director does. Funeral directors oversee much more than people might assume. First, they are responsible for knowing and following strict laws that related to a customer's very decision to hire them. Because of the past abuses by those in the death care industry, funeral directors are required by federal law to be very upfront from their very first encounter with a potential client about what services they provide and what their charges will be. They are required to present all who inquire about their services with a general price list that discloses what they are set up to do for a client and the prices they will ask. Creating, presenting, and adhering to this price list is a big part of a funeral director's job. This requires much knowledge of the death care industry and, specifically, current knowledge of laws and other issues that are always changing. Much of a funeral director's job, then, entails simply keeping up with the news of his profession and applying any changes to how he or she does the job. Aside from that, funeral directors must make sure they carry out the duties described on the price list to the customer's complete satisfaction. This includes arranging transportation of a body and coordinating plans with crematories, embalmers, pastors, cemetery staff, family members, and the various others who will be involved with the preparing of a body or conducting the funeral ceremony. Funeral directors must also assure that all legal paperwork is completed in an organized and timely fashion.
Some of the paperwork that we use to deal with a funeral and handling deceased individuals would be death certificates, disposition transit permits. The death certificate is used as a way to keep a record of people who have died, and just various information about their life history.
He or she must be sure laws regarding, say, coroner notification of a death are followed precisely, and in the case of deaths involving suspicious circumstances, he may even be required to cooperate a great deal with detectives and prosecutors. And of course, sometimes this may create conflict for a family, so again, a funeral director must always pay close attention to his or her legal duties on the job. All cases begin with a phone call. The first phone call is when the family trying to find a funeral home will learn all about the general price list and services that are rendered at the funeral home. It is also the family's first impression of the establishment, so it is important to make sure that the family knows that the director is there to help and not take advantage of someone in such a delicate time. From there, if the family decides to use the funeral home, the business will send a removal worker to go and pick up the deceased wherever it may be located, whether it be a home, a nursing home, or any other facility. The body is then placed in a mortuary body refrigerator. These vary in many sizes from the ability to hold 2 to 6 bodies. The temperatures in these are between 36 degrees Fahrenheit and 39 degrees Fahrenheit to slow down the decomposition process. In the next day or two, the family will come into the funeral home and sit down and discuss with the director what they would like to do. From there, the family has many different options for what they plan on doing with their deceased family member, but the most popular are either a full funeral, a direct cremation, or donating their loved ones to science. I will explain all these. Donating the deceased to science is not all what it seems. You as an individual can make the decision to have your body donated to science, or the immediate next of kin can make that decision at the time of death if that is what the family wishes. Something else to note is that it is not a true donation that you may be thinking of. It typically costs to donate your loved one. In Philadelphia, it's common to be around $200. Now, it is also very important to realize that there are some restrictions on whether or not a body can be donated.
Some of the reasons that a medical school would deny someone from being donated that has died would be obesity, someone who's overweight, any open sores, anything infectious or contagious, any broken bones or recent falls.
Upon the school's completion with the deceased, they will cremate the body, and the family can choose if they would like the cremated remains back of the family member. If they do not, then the remains are buried in a cemetery. If they do, the family will be given the remains and can hold a memorial service if they'd like. Cremation is now the leading method of handling a deceased across America. The projection for 2017 is that cremation will be around 51.6%, whereas burials will be around 42.3%. During cremation, the casket containing the body is placed in the cremator furnace and incinerated at a temperature of 760 to 1,150 degrees Celsius, or roughly 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit. In PA, the law requires that the body may not be placed in the crematory until it is 1,700 degrees Fahrenheit. The process usually takes 90 minutes to 2 hours, during which a large part of the body, the organs and other soft tissue, are vaporized and oxidized by the intense heat. Contrary to popular belief, what remains of the body, the cremated remains, are not ashes in the usual sense. After the incineration is completed, the dry bone fragments are removed from the cremator and pulverized by a machine called a cremulator to process them into ashes, also known as cremated remains or cremains. A magnet is run over the ashes to remove any remaining metal, such as medical staples. This leaves the bone with a fine sand-like texture and color, which can be buried or scattered. Ashes weigh about 1.8 kilograms for adult human females and 2.7 kilograms for males. From there, the family can receive them in the plastic container that the funeral home provides, or they can purchase an urn for the ashes to go into. The classic funeral is one that, although it is decreasing in the amount of people that use it, is still one that people use as often as a means of closure in this difficult time in their life. If a family plans to go with a classic-style funeral, the body of the deceased will need to be embalmed. Embalming, by law, is only allowed to be done by a licensed funeral director. There are two types of embalming: cavity and arterial. For cavity, a small incision is made near the belly button, and a sharp surgical instrument used for drainage called a trocar is inserted into the body cavity. Using the trocar, organs in the chest cavity and abdomen are punctured and drained of gas and fluid contents and then replaced with a formaldehyde-based chemical mixture. The incision is closed, and at this point the body is fully embalmed. For arterial embalming, the blood is removed from the body by way of the veins and replaced with an embalming solution through the arteries. The embalming solution is usually a combination of formaldehyde, glutaraldehyde, methanol, ethanol, phenol, and water, and may also contain dyes in order to simulate a lifelike skin tone. This is done in a morgue with tools like the embalming machine, which uses pressure to disperse the fluid throughout the body, and other typical medical tools for making incisions and suturing incisions. Another aspect of a funeral are restorative art and makeup techniques. Restorative art is the art and science of rebuilding or reconstructing diseased, mutilated, or missing tissue so as to produce a normal lifelike appearance to the dead human body. This is done with items like clay, wax, plaster, and transplanting skin. Through this, a deceased that otherwise would be too mutilated to have an open casket funeral can have one and still look presentable. The makeup side that is taught in mortuary schools is learning how to apply makeup to the body to make them appear more lifelike. Much like how women and men may apply makeup for a night out on the town, a funeral director will apply similar makeup. These are extremely important to make sure that the deceased looks the way they did before their death, which is what the family is looking for, and that can help in the grieving process. The director will also dress the body in whatever clothing the family would like the deceased to be in the casket. The funeral can be arranged with the director for length of time and if they would like a representative from any faith there to give a sermon. Once that is completed, if the deceased is being buried in a cemetery, the licensed funeral director must be in attendance at the cemetery. At the cemetery, the casket will be lowered into a concrete vault under the ground or in a mausoleum. The director's job is not complete until the lid of the concrete vault is closed and sealed. At that point, the director has completed his or her duties. These three are what are typically the most common methods for taking care of loved ones, mainly because of their individual price points. The average funeral in North America can cost between $7,000 and $10,000. Direct cremations come in around $1,100. This may also be why cremations and donations have risen in popularity in more recent times.
I believe that there are a lot of reasons why cremations are being used over funerals. Some being that it's more cost effective. In every aspect, it's cheaper to have a cremation than a funeral. It's also cheaper if you wanted to bury them. To open a grave for that is cheaper. It's also you're not committed to burying, and if you move, visiting your loved one, you can take the ashes with you. Also, some people like to wear jewelry. You can now have jewelry. People like the idea of keeping their loved one close to them. So I think there's a lot of reasons as to why people might be interested in doing that.
Hancock Funeral Home has been able to thrive mainly because we keep our prices more reasonable than the national average, with our direct cremations being only $750.
So at our funeral home, we've tried over the 100 years that we've been in business to be as reasonably priced as possible so that we can help more people in our community who may not be as fortunate.
The industry of death is one that many people view as a mystery, and some are even frightened of the idea. Through pop culture, the idea of people associated with this profession are seen as odd. But really, it is about helping people at a time when they need it the most. Losing someone that you love is not easy, and if not for a funeral director leading the chain of events that happens after death, it may not be completed. It was Peter Pan who said to die would be an awfully big adventure. The funeral director makes sure that your final adventure is handled with dignity, respect, and compassion.